Before we begin, I need you to put on your headphones. Turn the volume up. Listen closely. Through these heavy layers of static, you will hear a sound. This is not a movie sound effect. It is not computer-generated audio. This is a real recording, frozen in time on a magnetic tape from November 1960. It is a heartbeat, but it is not a normal heartbeat. Pay attention to the frequency. It is beating at 140 beats per minute, then 150 medically. This is called extreme tachycardia. It is the sound of a human heart pushed to the edge of death by extreme terror and oxygen deprivation. But the most chilling part of this sound is not its speed. It is its source. Based on radio triangulation, this heartbeat was not coming from a hospital emergency room. It wasn't coming from a trench on a battlefield. It was coming from 100 miles above our heads, from the cold airless vacuum of low Earth orbit. Let's go back to the early 1960s. The height of the Cold War. On the outskirts of Turin, Italy, in a place called Torre Bert, lived two young brothers, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia. They were not spies. They were just amateur radio operators. But the antenna array they built on top of an abandoned bunker accidentally intercepted the Soviet Empire's darkest secrets. That night, as the brothers tuned their frequencies searching for Soviet satellites, they expected to hear the rhythmic beep-beep of Sputnik. That is the sound of a machine. But what they heard instead was heavy gasping. It was the sound of a human being inside a sealed metal can, struggling to survive as the oxygen slowly ran out. The brothers sat by their recorder, watching the tape spin, listening as that distant life slowly faded away in space, until the signal flatlined, until nothing remained but endless static. History books tell us a glorious story. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. He launched perfectly, landed perfectly, and returned to Earth with a hero smile. That is the official version. That is the textbook version. But behind the Soviet propaganda machine, there was an unwritten iron rule. Success is world news. Failure is a state secret. But what if there were others before Gagarin? What if, behind that perfect smile, lay countless failed launches? What if some were launched, but never came back? What if their bodies are still floating in the darkness, circling the Earth in frozen tombs? These are known as the lost cosmonauts. For decades, they were dismissed as conspiracy theories, rejected by the Kremlin as Western lies. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, as the file cabinets were finally opened, we discovered that many of those lies were facts. Today, we aren't just going to tell a ghost story. We are going to scientifically analyze these dusty tapes. We will deconstruct the fatal design flaws of the Vostok capsule. We will attempt to answer a question that has haunted historians for 60 years. In this silent darkness, how many unnamed souls are screaming into the radio? To understand the magnitude of this story, we must first look at the David and Goliath reality of 1957. On one side, you had the Soviet space program. It was a military juggernaut with unlimited funding, thousands of scientists, and the most advanced encryption technology on Earth. On the other side, you had Achille and Giovanni, two medical students in their 20s. They didn't have $1 billion budget. They didn't have CIA clearance. What they had was a broken-down, abandoned Nazi bunker outside Turin, and a genius-level understanding of radio physics. They built their listening station, codenamed Torre Bert, using literal garbage. They scavenged scrap metal from industrial junkyards. They repurposed old American receivers left behind after World War II. They constructed a massive, steerable antenna array using chicken wire and plumbing pipes. To the locals, it looked like a science project gone wrong. But functionally, it was one of the most sensitive listening ears in the Western Hemisphere. While the CIA was spending millions to guess what the Russians were doing, Achille and Giovanni were just listening. Listening. The brothers discovered a critical flaw in Soviet security. The Russians assumed that no one in the West was monitoring the specific frequencies used for their internal telemetry. They broadcasted their signals on 20.005 megahertz. Once Achille and Giovanni locked onto this frequency, they became the uninvited guests of the Kremlin, but detecting a beep is easy. Tracking a moving object in space is hard. This is where the Iron General's level of technical genius comes in. The brothers utilized the Doppler effect to calculate orbital data. Think of the sound of a passing ambulance. The siren S pitch is high as it comes toward you, and drops low as it drives away. Radio waves behave the same way. By measuring the precise microshifts in the signal's pitch as it crossed the Italian sky, the brothers could calculate the satellite's velocity, altitude, and trajectory with frightening accuracy. They could distinguish a spy plane from a rocket. They could tell a test satellite from a manned capsule. On October 4th, 1957, when Sputnik 1 launched, they tracked it. A month later, when the dog Leica was launched to her death on Sputnik 2, they heard her heartbeat. They proved that math doesn't lie, and soon, the math would tell them something terrifying. By 1960, the signals changed. The brothers began to intercept communications that didn't sound like mechanical telemetry. They sounded like voice loops. Breathing. Coughing. Morse code tapped out by a shaking hand. The Soviets claimed they were just testing voice synthesizers and broadcasting pre-recorded tapes to test radio equipment. That was the official line. There is no one up there. It's just a tape recorder. But Achille and Giovanni knew the difference between a tape and a human. A tape recorder doesn't hyperventilate when the capsule starts to spin. A tape recorder doesn't have a heart rate that spikes to 140 beats per minute during re-entry. The brothers realized they were witnessing history. But it wasn't the history being printed in the newspapers. They were listening to the ghosts before they became ghosts. Why a government would erase its own astronauts? You have to understand the psychology of the Cold War. In 1960, the space race was not a scientific expedition. It was an ideological war. For the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, space was the ultimate propaganda weapon. Every launch had to be perfect. Every cosmonaut had to be a Superman. There was no room for error. The American space program, NASA, was public. When their Vanguard rocket exploded on live TV in 1957, it was a national humiliation, but it was transparent. The Soviets operated in the shadows. If a mission failed, it never happened. The rocket was labeled a geophysical probe. The pilot was labeled a technician who died in a car accident. We now know, thanks to declassified archives opened in the 1990s, that this secrecy covered up horrific. Let me tell you the story of Valentin Bondarenko. You won't find his name in the textbooks from the 1960s. It was Zeta. Bondarenko was the youngest member of the first Cosmonaut team, the same class as Yuri Gagarin. He was 24 years old, handsome, talented, and destined for glory. In March 1961, just weeks before the first official spaceflight, Bondarenko was conducting a 15-day endurance test in a low-pressure isolation chamber in Moscow. Technical insight. To simulate the atmosphere of a spacecraft, the engineers made a fatal choice. They pressurized the chamber with 50% pure oxygen. In a normal room, oxygen is about 21%. At 50%, the environment becomes a ticking bomb. Materials that are normally safe become highly flammable explosives. On the 10th day, Bondarenko finished a medical check. He removed a biosensor from his skin and wiped the residue with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball. Without looking, he tossed the cotton ball toward a trash can. It missed. It landed on a hot electric plate used to warm his tea. The reaction was instantaneous. The oxygen-rich air didn't just catch fire, it exploded. The entire chamber turned into a blast furnace. Bondarenko's wool training suit soaked up the fire like gasoline. Because of the pressure difference, the doctors outside couldn't open the door. It took them several minutes to equalize the pressure. By the time they pulled him out, he was still conscious. He whispered, "It was my fault. Don't blame anyone else." He died 8 hours later. His body was so badly burned that the only place the doctors could find a blood vessel to insert an IV was the sole of his foot. What did the Soviet Union do? Did they mourn him? Did they learn from it? No. They erased him. They airbrushed his face out of official team photos. They forged his service records. His widow was given a pension and told to keep her mouth shut. For 25 years, the world didn't know Valentin Bondarenko existed. This is the context we are dealing with. If they could hide a man burning to death in a laboratory in downtown Moscow, imagine how easy it would be to hide a man dying in the infinite silence of space. How a human being gets lost in space. You have to look at the machine they were riding in. This is the Vostok 3K. It was the pride of the Soviet Union. But by modern standards, it was crude, dangerous, and terrifyingly simple. It consisted of 2 parts. The descent module Sherik, a 2.3-meter sphere covered in ablative thermal coating. This is where the cosmonauts sat. The instrument module. This carried the batteries, radios, and the crucial TDU retro rocket engine. Here is the terrifying engineering reality. The Vostok was not a spaceship that you could fly like a fighter jet. It had no wings. It had no maneuvering thrusters to change its orbit. Once it was launched, it was essentially a cannonball wrapped in metal. The pilot was not a pilot. He was a passenger in a tin can. The cosmonaut had zero control over his trajectory. He relied entirely on automation. And in 1961, Soviet automation was unpredictable. The mission profile for Vostok had a failsafe. The spacecraft was launched into a specifically calculated low-orbit perigee, 169 kilometers. The scientists calculated that even if the retro rocket engine failed completely, atmospheric drag would naturally slow the ship down. It would spiral back to Earth within 10 days. So, the engineers packed exactly 10 days of food, water, and oxygen. It was a brilliant plan. Unless the rocket overperformed, if the launch vehicle pushed the capsule just a few miles higher into a higher apogee, the atmospheric drag would disappear. Instead of 10 days, the natural orbital decay would take 20 days, or a month. The math of death. If the engine fails in a high orbit, the cosmonaut doesn't crash. He doesn't burn up. He simply floats. He eats his last meal on day 10. He takes his last breath of recycled air on day 11. And then he becomes a permanent satellite, a frozen body in a metal sphere, circling the Earth every 90 minutes, forever. This is the slow death scenario, but there was a faster, more violent way to die. Let's talk about re-entry. This is the most violent phase of spaceflight. To survive, the capsule must hit the atmosphere at a precise angle, often less than 2 degrees. We call this the keyhole. If the retro rocket fires for 5 seconds too long, or at the wrong orientation, the capsule enters too steeply. Technical insight, normal re-entry, the capsule experiences 8G. The heat shield reaches 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 1650 degrees Celsius. Ballistic re-entry steep. The G-force spikes to 10G, or 12G. This is enough to crush a human chest cavity. The heat load doubles, but the Vostok had a specific design flaw that made this even worse. The capsule was weighted to naturally spin so the heavy heat shield faced the fire, but it was connected to the instrument module by a bundle of thick steel cables. If those cables didn't cut cleanly after the retro fire, the 2 modules would stay attached. The ship would tumble wildly. The heat shield would not be facing the wind. The Hechta weakest point would be exposed to the plasma stream. This brings us to May 1961. And the recording that suggests this exact nightmare happened to a woman. May 1961. 1 month after Gagarin's success, the Judico-Cordiglia brothers were scanning the frequencies again. They picked up a signal on a Soviet frequency that shouldn't have been active. The Doppler analysis was terrifying. The signal was shifting rapidly, indicating an object that was not stable. It was tumbling, and it was entering the atmosphere. But this wasn't data. It was a voice. Listen closely. High-pitched static. A woman's voice. Distorted. Speaking Russian. This recording is controversial, but let's analyze it like a crash investigation. The voice is female. She is speaking Russian, and she is terrified. Let's break down the transmission, second by second.
Listen! Listen! Come in! Come in! Talk to me!
She is desperate for ground control, but usually, during re-entry, the plasma sheath, a layer of ionized air blocks, radio signals. The fact that we can hear her suggests she hasn't hit peak heat yet, or the tumbling is letting signals leak through.
I am hot. I am hot. What? 45? 50.
45 likely refers to the oxygen level or the angle of descent. But I am hot is the key. Inside a Vostok capsule, the temperature should be stable until the very last moment. If she is complaining of heat before the signal cuts out, it implies a hull breach or a cooling system failure.
Isn't this dangerous? It's all.
Her tone shifts from professional to panicked. She knows something is wrong.
I see a flame. I see a flame. I am hot. I am hot. 3241. Am I going to crash? Yes. Yes, I feel hot.
I see a flame. Think about that sentence. The Vostok capsule had small portholes. During a normal re-entry, the pilot sees a bright orange glow outside. It looks like the world is on fire. But if the capsule was tumbling, if the instrument module failed to separate, the fire wouldn't just be outside. The phrase "I am hot" uttered repeatedly suggests the internal temperature was rising rapidly. This matches the profile of a heat shield failure. If the heat shield was not facing the plasma stream, the aluminum hull of the hatch would melt in seconds. The temperature inside would jump from 70 degrees to 400 degrees instantly. The recording ends abruptly. This signifies either the destruction of the radio antenna by the heat or the impact. Officially, the first woman in space was Valentina Tereshkova in 1963. But if this tape is real, she was only the first to return. Who was this woman? Soviet records from May 1961 show no Monday launches, just a few unmanned satellite tests that burned up on re-entry. Was she labeled as unmanned? The screaming woman on the Judica Cordiglia tape remains nameless to this day. She is a ghost without a face. But there is another theory involving a man who had a very famous face and a very famous father. If that woman was erased because she failed, was there someone erased because he became a political liability? The most persistent theory points to one man, Vladimir Ilyushin. He was Soviet royalty. He was the son of Sergei Ilyushin, the legendary aircraft designer who built the Il-2 Sturmovik tank buster in World War II. Vladimir was arguably the best test pilot in Russia. He held altitude records. He was the poster boy for Soviet aviation. According to intelligence reports that surfaced in the West, Ilyushin launched on April 7, 1961. That is 5 days before Yuri Gagarin. The theory goes like this. The launch was successful, but the capsule malfunctioned. Ilyushin lost consciousness. During the descent, instead of landing in Russia, his capsule drifted off course and crashed in China. In 1961, relations between the Soviet Union and China were collapsing. They were rivals, not allies. The Kremlin faced a nightmare scenario. Their hero of the Soviet Union was lying in a Chinese hospital, essentially a prisoner of a rival state. They couldn't announce a victory. A hero in captivity is not a hero. He is a hostage. So, the Soviet machine did what it does best. They rewrote history. They scrubbed the mission. They claimed Ilyushin had been in a severe car accident to explain his physical injuries and his long hospitalization. Then, just days later, they rolled out the backup plan, the charming, perfect Yuri Gagarin. Is this true? We have no smoke and gun documents, but we know Ilyushin looked like a man who had fallen from the sky, not a man who hit a fender in a parking lot. And for those who say the Soviets would never send a man up in a broken machine, we have the tragic proof of Soyuz 1. This is not a theory. This is a fact. In 1967, the Soviets launched Vladimir Komarov in Soyuz 1. It was a rush job to celebrate Lenin's birthday. The political pressure was immense. Engineers had found 203 structural defects before the launch. 203. Komarov knew the ship was a coffin, but he flew anyway. Why? Because his backup pilot was his best friend, Yuri Gagarin. Komarov famously told a friend, "If I don't go, they'll send Yura. And he will die. I have to take care of him." The flight was a disaster from the moment of liftoff. Solar panels failed to deploy. Power failed. Orientation sensors failed. Komarov spent 24 hours fighting a dead ship manually, orbiting the Earth in a tumble. He managed to re-enter the atmosphere, a miracle of piloting skill. But when he deployed the main parachute, it didn't open. The reserve chute got tangled. Soyuz 1 slammed into the Russian steppe at 90 miles per hour. The impact flattened the capsule instantly. Retro rockets exploded on impact, turning the wreckage into a pool of molten metal. U.S. intelligence listening posts in Turkey intercepted Komarov's final transmission as he fell toward the ground. He wasn't singing patriotic songs. He was cursing. According to the NSA analysts, Komarov was screaming at the engineers and the politicians who put him in a botched spaceship. He died cursing the system that betrayed him. The Soviets couldn't hide Komarov because he was a public hero. His death was too big to erase. But if he had been an unknown test pilot in 1961, if he had been a nameless woman, they would have vanished into the static, just like the voices on the Torre Bert tapes. So, when you listen to that woman screaming about fire, ask yourself, is it a hoax? Or is it just another Komarov, whose name we were never allowed to know? Space is beautiful, but it is also the most hostile environment known to man. It does not care about politics, it does not care about bravery. It only cares about physics. Whether the names on the Judico Cordiglia tapes are real or not, they represent a truth we often forget. Exploration is built on bones. For every Gagarin who waves to the crowd, there is a Bondarenko burning in a chamber. For every Neil Armstrong, there is a Komarov cursing as he falls. The lost cosmonaut is not just a ghost story, it is the unknown soldier of the space age. Tonight, when you look up at the stars, remember that the silence up there might not be empty. Some signals just fade before we can decode them. What do you think? Are the Judico Cordiglia recordings the smoking gun of a Soviet cover-up? Or just Cold War paranoia? I read every comment, so let me know your theory below. If you want to keep these files open and explore the dark corners of history that others ignore, verify your clearance by hitting subscribe. Thank you for watching. To discover more untold stories of World War II, please click the video on your screen. See you next time.